The little girl had not spoken a single word in 4 years, and the billionaire mother who had spent millions searching for answers was beginning to believe that her daughter might never speak again. But that afternoon, at an ordinary neighborhood playground, a scarred single father crouched beside the silent child, noticed something nobody else had ever noticed, and did something that made her mother freeze in disbelief. The first sound that came from the little girl's mouth was only one trembling word, but it shattered years of silence. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please like this story, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, leave a comment with what you believe gives people the strength to heal, and subscribe to our channel so you can be part of our community for more stories that remind us that sometimes the person who saves a heart is the one nobody thought could. Vivian Ashford had built an empire from nothing, turning a small technology company inherited from her late father into a global corporation worth billions. Newspapers called her fearless. Business magazines called her brilliant. Competitors called her ruthless. But none of those words mattered to Vivian when she looked at her 8-year-old daughter, Elodie. To the world, Elodie was the quiet little girl who always stayed close to her mother, dressed in expensive clothes and protected by layers of private security. To Vivian, she was the child who used to fill every room with questions, laughter, and endless stories until one terrible afternoon changed everything. 4 years earlier, when Elodie was only 4, her father had died suddenly from a heart condition while driving them home. Elodie had been in the car. She survived the accident physically, but something inside her seemed to disappear that day. She stopped speaking. At first Vivian believed it was shock. Then she believed it was trauma. Doctors, specialists, therapists, child psychologists, speech experts, and neurological teams were brought into their lives. Every test came back with the same frustrating conclusion. Elodie could speak. There was no physical reason preventing her from speaking. But she simply did not. Vivian refused to accept that silence would become her daughter's future. She built therapy rooms inside their mansion. She hired specialists from across the country. She arranged private sessions with experts who charged more for 1 hour than most families earned in months. She bought every device and treatment recommended by anyone who promised even the smallest possibility of progress. Yet nothing worked. Elodie communicated through drawings, gestures, and a small notebook she carried everywhere. Sometimes she wrote a sentence and erased it before anyone could read it. Sometimes she would stare through a window for hours. And sometimes, when Vivian tried to encourage her to speak, Elodie would place both hands over her mouth as if protecting something fragile inside herself. That afternoon, Vivian decided to take her daughter somewhere completely ordinary. No therapists. No doctors. No assistants hovering nearby. Just a quiet public playground in a beautiful city park where children ran through green grass beneath the warm afternoon sun. Vivian hoped that perhaps being around other children would make Elodie feel normal again. She left most of the security team at a distance and pushed her daughter's small swing herself. Elodie watched other children laughing, climbing, and chasing one another, but she remained silent. Then she noticed a little boy sitting alone near a wooden bench. He was trying to repair the broken wheel of a toy truck while his father sat nearby. The father was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s named Callum Reed. His clothes were plain, his boots were worn, and there was something unusually disciplined about the way he carried himself. His dark hair had been cut short, and a faded scar ran from beneath his left ear toward his jaw. He was a single father raising his 6-year-old son, Finn, while working several ordinary jobs to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Nobody looking at him would have guessed that Callum had once served as a Navy SEAL. Nobody would have guessed that beneath the quiet exterior was a man who had survived missions that had left permanent scars on his body and memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Callum had left the military after an operation overseas changed the way he looked at life. He had lost friends. He had returned home carrying guilt that medals could never erase. After leaving the service, he deliberately chose a quiet life. He fixed boats, repaired machinery, and worked maintenance jobs whenever he could. He did not tell people about his military history unless absolutely necessary. He did not want admiration. He wanted peace. Most importantly, he wanted Finn to grow up knowing that his father was more than the worst things he had witnessed. When Finn's toy truck rolled toward Elodie, the little girl instinctively picked it up. She examined the broken wheel and then looked at Finn. Finn smiled. Elodie silently handed the truck back. Callum noticed the exchange and gave her a grateful smile. He did not ask why she wasn't talking. He did not stare at her. He did not treat her like she was broken. He simply returned to helping Finn. That small act caught Vivian's attention. She had become accustomed to people changing their behavior the moment they learned about Elodie's condition. Some became overly careful. Others became uncomfortable. Therapists constantly watched Elodie, analyzing every movement. Even strangers sometimes looked at her with pity. Callum did none of that. A few minutes later, Finn struggled to fix the wheel. Callum showed him how to use a small piece of wire to secure it. Elodie watched closely. Then, unexpectedly, she picked up a fallen stick and pointed toward another part of the wheel. Callum understood immediately. He adjusted the axle according to her suggestion, and the toy began rolling again. Finn laughed. Elodie's lips almost formed a smile. Callum noticed it but pretended not to. That was the moment something changed. Instead of praising her, questioning her, or encouraging her to speak, Callum simply placed the repaired truck on the ground and let Elodie push it. She did. Finn chased after it. For the first time in months, Elodie ran. Vivian stood several steps away, watching her daughter move freely. Then a sudden noise came from the playground. A metal gate slammed hard in the wind. Elodie froze. Her face went pale. She dropped the truck. Callum's military instincts returned before he even realized it. He immediately scanned the surroundings, identified the source of the noise, and positioned himself between Elodie and the disturbance without touching her. He lowered himself to her level and waited. Vivian rushed forward, but Callum gently motioned for her to slow down. Elodie was trembling. She covered her ears. Callum noticed her breathing pattern. It was shallow and fast. He recognized it because he had seen it in soldiers suffering from trauma. He knew that fear could become worse when everyone around you demanded that it stop. So he did something simple. He sat on the ground. He placed both hands where Elodie could see them. Then he began slowly tapping his fingers against his knee in a steady rhythm. Tap. 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 Elodie watched. Her breathing gradually slowed. Vivian stared at the stranger with astonishment. Callum did not know the details of Elodie's history, but he understood fear. He understood what it meant when the body remembered something the mind could not explain. After several minutes, Elodie looked at him. Callum pointed toward himself, then toward her, and waited. Elodie slowly pointed at him. He smiled. Then he pointed toward Finn. Elodie looked at Finn. For the first time, she opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Vivian held her breath. Elodie tried again. A tiny, broken sound escaped her throat. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth. Callum did not react dramatically. He did not clap. He did not celebrate. He simply smiled as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That mattered. Because Elodie tried again. This time, one word emerged. Callum. Vivian froze. The entire world seemed to stop around her. Her daughter had spoken. Not because someone had pressured her. Not because a machine had measured her voice. Not because a therapist had demanded progress. She had spoken because she felt safe. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. Callum looked equally stunned, but he quickly composed himself. He understood that this moment belonged to Elodie. He did not want to turn it into a performance. Vivian thanked him repeatedly, but Callum only shook his head. He told her through his calm expression that he had not done anything extraordinary. He had simply listened. But Vivian soon discovered that there was much more to Callum than she had first imagined. Her security team quietly ran a background check because she was a billionaire and Callum was a stranger who had suddenly become important to her daughter's emotional recovery. The report came back within hours, and Vivian was stunned. Callum Reid had served as a Navy SEAL. Not only had he served, but his record included commendations for rescuing wounded personnel during a dangerous overseas operation. Vivian remembered something she had never told anyone. 4 years earlier, after the accident that killed Elodie's father, a stranger had pulled her unconscious daughter from the wreckage before emergency crews arrived. Witnesses had described him only as a man wearing dark clothes who disappeared before the police could identify him. Vivian had spent years wondering who he was. When she saw Callum's military records, she noticed the date. Her heart stopped. It was the same day. She found an old photograph from the accident investigation and showed it to Callum. He looked at it for a long moment. Then his expression changed. He remembered. He had been driving nearby when he saw the crash. He had pulled Elodie from the vehicle because he could hear her crying. He remembered holding her tiny hand while waiting for paramedics. He remembered telling her to keep breathing. But he had never known what happened afterward. Vivian began crying. She realized that the stranger who had saved her daughter's life 4 years ago had unknowingly returned to her life at the exact moment Elodie needed him again. Yet the story did not become simple. Vivian had spent years protecting herself with wealth and control. She wanted Callum to become part of Elodie's recovery immediately. She offered him money, a permanent position, a house, anything he wanted. Callum refused. Not because he disliked Vivian. Because he understood that healing could not be purchased. He told her through a quiet explanation that Elodie did not need another person controlling her life. She needed people who would let her feel safe enough to choose her own path. Vivian was hurt. She was accustomed to solving problems. Callum was telling her that her greatest strength had become her daughter's greatest cage. For the first time, Vivian saw herself through someone else's eyes. She realized that she had been so terrified of losing Elodie that she had forgotten to let her live. Over the following weeks, Vivian changed. She reduced the endless therapy schedule. She took Elodie to ordinary places. She let her choose what clothes to wear. She stopped finishing her daughter's sentences. She stopped asking whether she was going to speak. Callum and Finn became part of their lives naturally. Elodie began speaking more often. At first, it was only a few words. Then short sentences. Then questions. Her voice was soft and uncertain, but it was hers. Callum also began changing. He had spent years believing that his military past made him dangerous, damaged, and unworthy of a peaceful family life. Watching Elodie recover taught him something he had forgotten. Survival was not the end of healing. Sometimes survival was the beginning. Finn adored Elodie, and Elodie adored him. The two children became inseparable during their afternoon visits to the park. They built imaginary cities from sticks and stones. They raced toy cars through the grass. They argued over whose turn it was to use the swing and then forgave each other 5 minutes later. Vivian watched Callum with Finn and slowly realized that his greatest strength was not his military training. It was his patience. He never demanded love. He simply gave it. One afternoon, months after their first meeting, Vivian returned to the same playground with Elodie. The sun was warm. Children were laughing. Finn was chasing bubbles across the grass. Elodie suddenly took her mother's hand. She looked at her. Then she said something Vivian had waited years to hear. She told her mother that she was no longer afraid of remembering her father. Vivian broke down. She knelt and hugged her daughter. Elodie hugged her back. Then she looked toward Callum. He was standing several yards away with Finn, watching them quietly. Elodie ran to him. She wrapped her arms around his waist. Callum closed his eyes and held her gently. Vivian realized that the man she had once seen as a stranger had become something far more meaningful. Not a savior. Not a therapist. Not a hero from a military record. A friend. A father. A man who had taught her that sometimes the greatest act of love is not forcing someone to heal, but giving them enough safety to heal in their own time. Years later, Elodie would still remember the playground where she found her voice. She would remember the broken toy truck. The loud metal gate. The scar on Callum's face. The rhythm of his fingers tapping against his knee. Most of all, she would remember that nobody demanded anything from her. Someone simply stayed. Vivian eventually understood that wealth could buy the finest doctors, the biggest houses, and the most sophisticated treatments in the world, but it could never buy the one thing her daughter had needed most. Safety. And Callum understood that his past had not destroyed his ability to love. It had taught him how precious love was. In time, Vivian and Callum became partners not because one rescued the other, but because they learned to stand beside each other without trying to control each other's wounds. Finn gained a second family. Elodie gained her voice. And Vivian finally learned that protecting someone does not mean building walls around them. Sometimes it means opening the gate and trusting them to walk through it. One warm afternoon, years after that first meeting, Elodie stood on the same playground and watched a younger child sitting alone near the swings. The child looked frightened and unsure. Elodie walked over. She sat beside her. She did not ask why the little girl was quiet. She did not tell her that everything would be fine. She simply stayed. And when the child finally looked at her, Elodie smiled and offered her hand. Across the playground, Callum watched with quiet pride while Vivian stood beside him with tears in her eyes. The little girl who once could not speak had become the person who knew how to make others feel heard. If this story touched your heart, leave a meaningful comment telling us what lesson stayed with you most, that healing needs patience, that kindness can reach places money cannot, or that sometimes the person who changes our life is simply the one who refuses to give up on us. And if you believe everyone deserves forgiveness, hope, kindness, and a second chance, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes a miracle does not arrive with flashing lights or headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it sits beside you on the ground. Sometimes it says nothing at all. It simply stays until you are brave enough to find your voice again.